For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a designee of the Majority Leader pursuant to House Resolution 5, I call up House Resolution 11 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 11, resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party.
Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader or their respective designees. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on House Resolution 11.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of House Resolution 11, a resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. This Select Committee will be charged with addressing the urgent threat to the United States and our allies posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Speaker, the ongoing threat posed by Communist China and the fact that the CCP cannot be trusted as a global partner has been apparent to the American people for some time. In 2019, at the behest of then Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, House Republicans created the China Task Force to review Communist China's actions and to make policy recommendations to protect U.S. interests against the Chinese Communist Party. Republicans sought to make this task force bipartisan and extended an open invitation to Democrats to join us, but unfortunately House Democrats chose not to participate at that time. I hope they do at this time. The China Task Force ultimately produced a report with more than 400 policy recommendations, many of them bipartisan. Today, we're taking the next logical step with the creation of a Select Committee empowered to investigate and respond to the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat that threatens our very way of life. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated time and time again that it is more interested in being America's foe than America's friend. The events of the past 3 years have brought into stark focus how Communist China's actions affect the United States and the rest of the world. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began inside China's borders, the world has experienced constant disruptions and chaos. Indeed, Communist China's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic is emblematic of its approach to many other things, attempting to cover up the pandemic's existence, resisting all efforts to investigate its origins, committing horrific human rights abuses, and refusing to work productively with the global community to combat the pandemic. It's also become apparent that far too many economically critical supply chains are tied to China, which threatens our economic and national security. We are dangerously dependent on China for basic building blocks of our economy. The result is shortages of critical products like semiconductors and rare earth minerals, both of which are largely produced in China today, along with the shortages of pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment, which threatens our ability to battle future pandemics. Our national and economic security requires us to secure our vulnerable supply chains and indeed to bring them back home to America. Communist China has also undertaken aggressive actions designed to expand their influence both in the United States and abroad. Communist China is a prolific thief of American intellectual property, violating countless patents and failing to respect international and domestic intellectual property laws. They have undertaken a systematic effort to infiltrate American colleges and universities through their support of the so-called Confucius Institutes and other organizations designed to spread Chinese propaganda. Chinese spy networks operate both on American soil and in cyberspace, and popular Chinese-owned apps like TikTok spread more propaganda and take massive amounts of Americans' personal data back to the Chinese government. In addition, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has spread the tentacles of the so-called People's Liberation Army throughout the world, particularly the developing world. and has ensnared dozens of developing countries in debt-trap diplomacy. Communist China continues to aggressively push into the South China Sea and militarize small islands, threatening freedom of navigation in this strategically important region. And they relentlessly and aggressively provoke Taiwan, an island that demonstrates to the world what a free, democratic, and capitalist China could look like. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is Communist China is a serious generational threat that we must address before it's too late. China exhibits expanding economic and military power coupled with the uncompromising rejection of our values and those of our allies. That's why the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party is critical. It will be charged with reviewing our economic dependence on China and restoring safe and secure supply chains, on reviewing China's actions toward the United States and our allies, on restoring American domestic institutions to protect them against Chinese infiltration and propaganda, and so much more. I urge all members on both sides of the aisle to join me in support of this resolution so we can stand united against Communist China. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think before I begin, I'd just like to ask any of my Republican colleagues whether anybody found the secret 3-page memo detailing all the concessions that were made to the most extreme elements of the Republican conference. Anyone? I heard that Speaker McCarthy told members during a closed conference meeting that there is no official document, a 3-page addendum to the House Rules package detailing these concessions. But none of us ever said it was official. If it was official, it would have been in the official rules package. But I also took note of the fact that in Axios today, we saw this. It says, one thing the document doesn't contain, according to NRCC Chair Richard Hudson, who said that he's seen it, is promised committee chairmanships for specific members, quote, no names, just representation on panels, end quote. So we were able to find out from Mr. Hudson what's not in that secret memo, but it would be helpful maybe before the end of the day if we could actually get the document so that the American people know what was promised. In any event, Mr. Speaker, China has the second largest economy in the world, and there is no doubt that their government seeks to extend their sphere of influence and export their model of authoritarianism abroad. The question is, how should the United States respond? For the past 4 years, I've served as chair and co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. We have monitored China's compliance with international human rights and rule of law standards. Under my leadership, alongside Senators Jeff Merkley and Marco Rubio and Congressman Chris Smith, the Commission has continued to draw attention to the Chinese government's human rights violations and technology-enhanced authoritarianism. We passed my bill, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which seeks to address the genocide in Xinjiang, and we hope can serve as a model for future human rights legislation. We passed the Tibet Policy and Support Act to support the people of Tibet in their struggle against Chinese repression, and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to require the U.S. government to impose sanctions against mainland China and Hong Kong officials considered responsible for human rights abuses in Hong Kong. Now, everything that we accomplished at the CECC has been because that commission operates in a bipartisan manner with nonpartisan staff. Our comprehensive annual reports are widely respected by government officials, academics, and advocacy community, and the advocacy community, because they are well researched and they are fact-based. And that brings us to today. Mr. Speaker, we are here to consider the creation of a select committee. This select committee on China would investigate and submit policy recommendations on the status of China's economic, technological, and security progress, as well as its ongoing competition with the United States. I'll be honest, I have reservations here. Many of us have concerns about this turning into a committee that focuses on pushing Republican conspiracy theories and partisan talking points. We certainly don't want it to turn into a place that perpetuates anti-Asian hate. We cannot and we will not tolerate that. But instead, I would hope that this new committee would work in a similar fashion as the CECC, producing bipartisan work with a fact-based tone and approach that could be received by the international community seriously and substantively. And there are a few things I think the Select Committee needs to keep in mind if they truly want to be effective. First, President Trump repeatedly mislabeled COVID with racist language. Such rhetoric coincided with spikes in hate-based acts of violence and discrimination against people of Chinese or Asian origin across our country. This language has no place on this committee or anywhere in Congress. Second, this committee should not seek to focus solely on military solutions. Yes, China's military modernization is a legitimate issue, but that does not demand a military-first policy response. Third, I'm concerned that a committee focus myopically on the economic, technological, and security challenges of China could distract us from the need to build a holistic approach in many of these policy areas. We need to remember that the United States faces economic, technological, and security challenges from many different regions across the globe, not just China. And to focus solely on China, whether it be policy related to trade, tech, authoritarianism, or anything else, is neither analytically sound nor effective. Fourth and finally, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, said that if he were to chair this committee, he would focus on, I quote, ideological competition and human rights, end quote. And I would just like to say that human rights are not ideological. Human rights are fundamental and universal, protected by a vast body of international law, codified at the United Nations and widely adjudicated. They apply to every person in every country and territory on Earth. It is the Chinese Communist Party, in fact, that portrays human rights along an ideological divide. That falsely portrays Chinese values as something distinct from Western values in an effort to justify its repression of the people of China. It's important that the committee does not adopt the rhetoric of Chinese officials. So while I do have concerns here, after reading the resolution itself, I will be voting yes. The Democratic Party has led the way in implementing efforts to monitor China's compliance with international human rights and rule of law standards, and we will continue to do so here. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
On this vote, the yeas are 3. On this vote, the yeas are 365 and the ayes are 65. The resolution